Now, one of the topics that I skipped over just a second ago has everything to do with the configurations baked directly into that configuration file for each VM. That VMX file we took a quick look at here under configuration parameters, where some of the different configs that exist in that VMX file are exposed here, and we can make changes if we want to here in this location. The VMX files are something you've probably paid attention to before in your work with VMware Workstation. I mean, in versions prior to some of the more recent versions of VMware Workstation, in order to get ESXi running inside of Workstation, there was a manual hack where you had to add in some lines into that VMX file. Well, these days you don't have to do that, but because of that, most of us have at least done some hacking around inside of the VMX files associated with VMware Workstation. What's great about them, however, is that those VMX files that exist in server, here in the ESXi server, are relatively the same towards what, or in comparison with what you've seen already there with VMware Workstation itself. And in fact, if I pop over here and take a look at my storage, and then come here to my vSAN data store and take a look at the files that are currently on this vSAN data store, here is the location where all the different files that comprise each virtual machine exist. So here for VM1, for example, if I take a look, I can find the VMDK file right here for VM1. Here is the VMX file also for VM1, as well as some other files that exist here as well that facilitate its everyday execution. And it's this VMX file here which we can download and then take a look at inside of Notepad to get a better feel for what kinds of settings exist in that file. In fact, let me minimize things here so we can take a look at a copy of the VMX file that I've downloaded here onto this machine. And I'm going to open it up here with Notepad so that we can take a look inside the file itself. Here you'll see, in fact, let's not open it up in Notepad. Let's open it up in WordPad so that we can actually see the individual configurations here on a line-by-line basis. These are essentially a long series of name-value pairs that associate with the different kinds of, for example, devices that are associated here for the virtual machine. Is SCSI 0 present? Is SATA 0 present? What is the VRAM size for SVGA? What's the memory size for this virtual machine? The order of these items in most situations doesn't matter at all. It's just the fact that they exist here in the file. The entirety of the file tends to be read all at once. So if you do need to make changes, typically we just add them right down here at the bottom where you would add your additional lines in order to modify the configuration of that virtual machine. If you're doing so, however, more so here in the vSphere environment than in the VMware Workstation environment, I would unregister the virtual machine. Not only power it down, but unregister it from my vSphere environment before I make any manual changes here into this file itself. Or I would use that little wizard that I showed you just a second ago where I can add rows there into the file. These will ensure that you don't end up creating some weird state where the virtual machine is not entirely sure of which changes that you've added. Now, if you're taking the VCP exam, I would just have a familiarity of all of the different configurations that exist here. And although there are a lot of them, just understanding what they are and what they correspond with is probably a really good idea. Now, in addition to all the different configurations that exist here, and I'm not going to run through what all these are because we've ostensibly been working with them as we've been building and executing our virtual machines, I do also want to spend just a quick minute talking about the files themselves. Now, there are a large number of possible files that can exist whenever you're dealing with your configuration for VMs and also their execution. We're aware of what the VMX file is because we just took a look at it here, and you're probably also aware of the VMDK file, the contents of that machine's virtual disk. But there are really kind of 6 or perhaps even more other kinds of files divided up by file name extension that correspond with different kinds of aspects of that virtual machine, like the BIOS or EFI configuration of that machine in a .nvram file. In fact, we saw that just a second ago when we looked at the virtual machine itself. If we have snapshots for that virtual machine, the VMSD file can be the configuration of the snapshot, and then the VMSN can be the contents of the snapshot. So a metaphor here for VMX versus VMDK is VMSD versus VMSN. If I've suspended the virtual machine, the contents of that suspended VM are here under a VMSS file. The swap file is a .vswap or a .vswp file. And then there will be a long list of .log files that also exist for the virtual machine that you can actually parse through to try to figure out exactly why that virtual machine is not behaving in the way you might think. Again, if I'm taking a VCP, I would know what these are. Even if you're not, though, being aware of what these are can really help you as you're going about moving virtual machines around. Out of all of these, the one file that absolutely must be necessary, that has to be there in order for the virtual machine to operate, is the VMDK file. That's really the only file you really need to transfer around in order to get that virtual machine moved into a new location. And so it's this VMDK file that you would need to have in some remote location if you were going through a manual transfer of that VM from one location to the other. So the other ones actually can get recreated on demand as you go about powering on the VM and beginning its everyday execution, but be aware that VMDK file is what's necessary. Your vSphere environment can even recreate a VMX based off the configuration you apply then to the VMDK after you import it into the environment. So all of these, again, I would be aware of what they are. I would have an understanding or at least a basic familiarity of the internal contents of that VMX, because who knows, the potential for awesome test questions exist here.